I will not negotiate with criminals or thugs. The Falkland Islands belong to Britain, and I want them back.
A small sitting room in Chelsea, London, curtains drawn against the afternoon light. An elderly woman sits by the window, a blanket over her knees, watching the street for someone who is never going to arrive. Each time she is told that her husband of more than 50 years has died, she says only one word. Oh. Then she asks the same question she always asks. Were we all there? 2 decades earlier, that same woman stood at a podium in the House of Commons and crushed a leadership challenge with a single, merciless political maneuver. She had just broken the National Union of Mine Workers, faced down Argentina in the South Atlantic, and told the Soviet Union exactly what she thought of it. She was, at that moment, arguably the most powerful woman on Earth. How does the most feared leader in Cold War Europe end up unable to remember that her own husband is gone? In the next few minutes, you will discover what happened inside a broken-down Peugeot in the Sahara Desert in January 1982, when her only son vanished for 6 days and there was nothing. Not power, not the RAF, not the Prime Minister of Great Britain, that could bring him back on command. You will discover the exact figure, $285,000, that later moved through his hands toward a coup on another continent. And you will discover the sentence her daughter wrote about the parent she never quite had. There is one object that returns before this film ends. A plain diary, the kind any busy person might keep, in which a prime minister tracked her days down to the minute. What you're about to hear has not been told quite this way before. Quick pause before we go any further. Documentaries like this take obsessive research to build. No studio, no network, just a genuine commitment to stories that actually deserve to be told. We are aiming to hit 1,000 subscribers by the end of this month. If this story already has you, hit subscribe. Be one of the originals, the ones who were here before this channel took off. One click. That is all it takes. And drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you are watching from. I read every single one. We're almost there. Let's finish this together. Chapter 1. The origin of the void. We begin not with the legend. We begin with the arithmetic underneath it. On the 15th of August, 1953, at a London hospital, a young barrister named Margaret Thatcher gave birth to twins, Carol and Mark, 6 weeks premature, delivered by emergency cesarean. She had just qualified as a lawyer that same year. According to her own later account, her husband Dennis's first reaction on seeing the newborns was to remark that they looked like rabbits. A very English deflection from the terror of 2 premature infants in incubators. Here is the seed. Within months, Margaret Thatcher was already plotting her return, not to motherhood but to politics. She stood, unsuccessfully, as the Conservative candidate in a 1955 by-election with 2-year-old twins at home. She would be selected for Finchley 3 years later and enter Parliament in 1959. Her children were, by her own design, raised largely by nannies and sent to boarding school young. A decision Carol would later describe, with the dry understatement her mother taught her, as one born of the belief that it wasn't worth keeping a household running for just one child left behind. What the twins were not given was ordinary, unstructured time with their mother. What they were given instead was structure. Discipline. A parent whose love, when it was visible at all, expressed itself through organization. A folded shirt, a corrected essay, a diary entry marking exactly when the next visit would occur, and for exactly how long. This is the thing biographers of powerful people rarely say plainly. The same ruthless efficiency that let Margaret Thatcher out-argue cabinet ministers twice her size was, in the nursery, indistinguishable from absence. She was building a country. Somewhere in Kent and later in Chelsea, 2 children were quietly learning that her attention was a resource to be earned, scheduled, and never assumed. Chapter 2. The First Collision. We move forward now nearly 30 years, to the moment the world first learned there was a limit to what this woman could control. By January 1982, Margaret Thatcher had been Prime Minister for almost 3 years, presiding over a country she was reshaping by force of will alone. And yet, within days, something would go wrong in a place utterly outside her jurisdiction: the empty vastness of the Sahara Desert. Her son Mark, then 29, had entered the Paris-Dakar rally with almost no preparation. By his own later admission, he had done half a day of testing before setting off from the Place de la Concorde. Do not ask yet how a prime minister's son ended up navigating a Peugeot across the Algerian desert. Only remember 3 things: a broken axle, 50 kilometers off course, and a convoy that drove on without him. On day 3 in Algeria, Mark Thatcher's car separated from the rally pack near the Mali border. Then it broke down. Then it vanished. For 6 days, nobody, not the French organizers, not the Algerian military, not his own mother, knew whether he was alive. Margaret Thatcher was about to learn that command of a nuclear-armed nation does not translate into command of a stalled engine in the open desert. She rerouted an RAF Hercules over foreign airspace. She telephoned the British ambassador in Algiers directly. Ronald Reagan called from the White House to offer his and Nancy's support. The Algerian government scrambled 5 aircraft. The French sent 3 more. None of it moved any faster because the Prime Minister of Great Britain was the one asking. In public, she projected the same composure that had steadied a nation through the Falklands crisis months later. In private, aides described a woman visibly shaken, telling television cameras, with a strain rarely heard in her voice, that there was still no news. For 6 days, the most powerful negotiating instrument in Britain, reputation, office, bought her nothing but the right to wait, exactly like every other frightened parent, until a helicopter crew finally spotted a stripped-down station wagon and 3 exhausted people 31 miles off course. He came home. She insisted on personally paying part of the search costs herself. And something in the family's private arithmetic had already begun, quietly, to shift. Chapter 3. The Divergence. Here is the part no biography fully explains. What changed privately inside that family after the desert? By most accounts, very little changed in the way it should have. If anything, the near loss of Mark seemed to deepen an imbalance that had existed since the nursery. Carol, the quieter twin, the one who had gone to university and built a career as a journalist, watched her brother remain, in her own later description, the star. Mark, meanwhile, moved into international business deals that traded heavily and controversially on the simple fact of his surname, while facing repeated accusations that his mother's office shielded him from consequences that would have ended an ordinary businessman's career. Carol never accused her mother of open favoritism. She didn't need to. In her 2008 memoir, she wrote of her upbringing with the same flat, controlled honesty her mother had modeled for her, noting, in effect, that she had always felt she came second of the two. That single sentence, dry, unembellished, devastating, tells you more about the private cost of the Thatcher household than any cabinet transcript ever could. It is not a complaint. It reads almost like a memo, a daughter filing an observation the way her mother might have filed a policy note. Which is perhaps the saddest detail of all. Even the language of grievance in this family had been trained into efficiency. Meanwhile, Mark Thatcher's business ventures continued to expand across the Middle East and Southern Africa through the 1980s, built on access his surname opened and relationships his mother's government made possible, whether she intended it or not. The favored child was being handed the keys to a world his sister was never offered. Nobody in Downing Street seemed to notice, or perhaps no one was willing to say so out loud. Chapter 4. The Second Collision. This was not the first time the Thatcher name would collide with catastrophe abroad. But the second time, in 2004, it was different in one crucial way. By then, Margaret Thatcher no longer had the power to fix it. In March of that year, a group of mercenaries was arrested in Zimbabwe, accused of plotting to overthrow the government of Equatorial Guinea and install an exiled opposition leader in exchange for preferential access to the country's oil reserves. It became known in the British press as the Wanga coup. By August, South African police had arrested Sir Mark Thatcher at his home outside Cape Town. Here is the forensic account. Investigators established that Mark Thatcher had transferred roughly $285,000 toward chartering a helicopter the plotters intended to use in the coup attempt. In January 2005, he pleaded guilty in a Cape Town court to unwittingly contravening South Africa's anti-mercenary laws, insisting to the end that he had believed the helicopter was for humanitarian use. He was fined roughly $506,000 and given a 4-year suspended sentence, avoiding prison only by agreeing to leave South Africa for good. This time there was no RAF Hercules, no phone call from Reagan, no personal check written to cover the cost of a rescue. This time, the woman who had once rerouted military aircraft for her son was 78 years old, increasingly frail, and already showing the private signs of the memory loss her family had not yet made public. A spokesperson for her office offered only a brief statement that she was relieved the matter had been settled. The real secret buried in that South African courtroom was not a helicopter or a coup gone wrong. It was the shape of a life built, from the very beginning, on inherited access rather than earned achievement. The exact inversion of everything his mother had spent her own career proving about herself. She had climbed to power from a grocer's flat above a shop in Grantham through sheer, relentless discipline. Her son had been handed doors that opened simply because of his name, and had walked through one of them into a South African courtroom. Chapter 5: The Great Reversal. Here, now, is the first of the 3 details promised at the start of this film. Remember the diary? It was not a metaphor. Those close to the Thatcher household described her almost compulsive habit of tracking her schedule, in her own hand, down to individual minutes, visits, calls, engagements, all filed with the same discipline she brought to cabinet meetings. Colleagues and family recalled it as endearing. In hindsight, it reads as something closer to evidence. A woman who could organize an empire's diplomacy, but who recorded her family time in the same ledger as everything else, allotted rather than given freely. Dennis Thatcher died in June 2003, after 52 years of marriage, from pancreatic cancer. He had been the one constant, unglamorous presence who absorbed the daily cost of her ambition without ever asking for public credit. With him gone, the buffer that had quietly held the family's private life together disappeared. What followed was cruel in its ordinariness. Margaret Thatcher's memory, already declining, worsened. And it was Carol, the twin who had always felt she came second, who became, by necessity, the one who stayed. She was the one who had to sit beside her mother again and explain, gently, that Dennis was not coming back. She was the one who watched her mother's face fall each time, hear the same quiet, oh, the same soft question. Were we all there? Here is the second of the 3 details promised at the start of this film. The rift this produced never fully healed. Mark Thatcher, living largely abroad through these years, was a far less constant presence in his mother's decline than his sister. Carol would later say, in the plainest terms she ever used publicly about her family, that she had come to understand her mother far better through the difficult work of caring for her at the end than through anything she'd experienced growing up in her shadow. Here is the element that reframes everything that came before. In 2008, Carol Thatcher published a memoir revealing publicly, for the first time, that her mother had been living with dementia for years, a fact the family had kept private even as it worsened. This is the thesis promised at the beginning of this film, now fully earned. This was never really a story about the Falklands or the miners or a superpower standoff with Moscow. It was always a story about what a life organized entirely around duty and discipline produces, in the end, inside the people who lived closest to it. Return now to that room in Chelsea, the same window, the same woman in the last years of her life, waiting for a husband who is not coming, cared for by the daughter she once, by her own admission, made feel like she came second. Here is the 3rd detail promised at the start. Told again that Dennis was gone, she did not rage or resist. She simply looked at her daughter, softly, and asked once more whether they had all been there, as if the only thing dementia had truly taken from her was the certainty that, at the end, her family had actually gathered around her. She built a version of Britain that outlived her by decades. She could not, in the end, build a peace inside her own home. The Iron Lady who never once, in 11 years in office, showed the world a crack in her composure spent her final years unable to hold on to the one fact that mattered most. That someone she loved was gone, and someone else had stayed. That if this documentary made you think, subscribe. We are this close to 1,000 subscribers this month, and every single one matters. Don't be the person who watched the whole thing and disappeared. Drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. Tell me which part of her story hit different. I read every single one. There are more stories like this one waiting. Stories about people who had everything and made choices no one could explain. Be here for them. Subscribe, comment, and I'll see you on the next one.